excited to present the first of 3 family workshops in our series. Today we will be speaking about understanding your child's IEP, a review of the different IEP components and sections. My name is Nathan Yakubov, and I will be joined by Melissa Monaco, also our supervisor psychologist. Before we continue, I just want to make note of the translation line. We do have live interpretation available in Mandarin, Spanish, and Korean, and the information is there.
And Nathan, we're going to let the interpreters make their announcements right now in their language.
Good morning, Spanish interpreter. I'll be making the announcement. Buenos días. Para escuchar la interpretación en español, por favor llame al número 347-966-4114 y entre el código 322-209-523, símbolo numeral. Repito, para la línea de español, por favor llame al número 347-966-4114 y marque la identificación 322-209-523, símbolo numeral. Si va a estar presente en la presentación y también en la línea de español, por favor asegúrese de poner sus dispositivos en silencio. Muchas gracias. The Spanish announcement has now finished.
All right, can one of our Mandarin interpreters make the announcement? Okay, does our Korean interpreter want to make the announcement?
Yes, 한국어 통역이 필요하신 분은 347-966-4114로 전화하신 다음에 여기 밑에 있는 아이디를 지금 입력하시고 아이디 515-879를 넣으신다 057을 누르시고 그런 다음에 샵 누르시면 됩니다. That'd be it.
Thank you. And our Mandarin interpreter? Yeah, so I'm sorry, for a Mandarin interpreter, we can't hear you. I see that you're unmuted, but I can't, we can't hear you. It might help to unmute Teams also, if you're on Teams also. Sometimes they connect to each other.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, loud and clear. Yes.
Oh,
Thank
great.
you.
Okay.
Go ahead, sir, I'm sorry.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. We are the Mandarin interpreters, Siu Tong and Yudi. 各位家长早上好，若需要国语翻译的，请打专线电话347-966-4114，密码是201-020-373，输入密码后请再按井字，谢谢。Thank you.
Great. All right, Nathan, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for that. Just introduction again. My name is Nathan Yakubov, and I am the administrator of special education for District 25. My contact information is here on the screen, and parents, you can feel free to reach out to me for any questions about evaluations, services, assistive technology, or placement issues. We are joined this morning by Melissa Monaco, our supervisor school psychologist, and I'll give her a second to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Melissa Monaco, and I am the supervisor psychologist for District 25. My office is located at 2811 Queens Plaza on the 4th floor, and I could be reached via email at mmonaco7@schools.nyc.gov.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. So we're going to be talking today about the components of an individualized education program, or an IEP. Before we talk about the components of the IEP, we really want to just define what is an IEP. So all students with disabilities who require special education services have an individualized education program, an IEP. The IEP, which we'll be talking about today, contains information about your child's interests, their strengths, their needs, their goals, and the educational program that we're recommending to put in place for them. It is a legal document and describes how the Department of Education will provide your child with a free and appropriate public education, which they are entitled to under the law, in the least restrictive environment, which means that we want them to be as much as possible in a school and around students that are typically developing, so they can interact with them as well. So when we talk about the IEP team, whenever we have an IEP meeting and we develop an IEP, there is a team, and the team members required to attend an IEP meeting might differ depending on the type of meeting. For example, if this is the first time that we're recommending services, you may have a certain people at the meeting. If this is a review of the current services, you may have other people at the meeting, depending on what is being considered at the meeting. If it's uncertain about what changes will be considered at the meeting, then we would ask all members that could be required to be at that meeting, because we would not limit any changes to the meeting based on who's there or not. We would go make sure to invite those people to the meeting in advance
Just business card or gift card?
to make sure that those people are at the meeting if any of those changes need to be made. And when we talk about possible members of the IEP team, you can see on the screen on the second box, these are possible members. The parent is always invited to IEP meetings, and they're definitely part of the IEP team. We also require a district representative, and sometimes that could be the school psychologist as well. And that's a person who will be able to represent the district in terms of the process and the laws and the regulations about the IEPs. The special education teacher is a teacher that understands special education programs and services and can speak to that. Related service provider is somebody who is providing some type of related services, for example, a speech therapy or occupational therapy or physical therapy. We have a general education teacher, which is a regular classroom teacher. There may be a school social worker at the meeting as well. Sometimes there could be a parent member, and this is a parent of a student with a disability in the district who can support the parents at the meeting. And sometimes we may want to have a physician at the meeting depending on the needs of the student as well. And I just want to point out that any individual can be invited to the IEP meeting on the basis of the parent feeling that that person has some information, knowledge, or special expertise that they can provide on behalf of the student at that meeting. And they would just tell the team in advance that they would like this person to be invited to the meeting as well. So moving into, and I just want to mention also that the chat is open if there are questions, if somebody wants to put a question in the chat. And then I guess we'll pause after each section and just to open it up for if there's any questions as well. So the first part of the IEP is what we call the present levels of performance and individual needs. A lot of times it's called the PLOP for short, but that's the present levels of performance and individual needs. And what this section covers is really your child or the student's current performance, academically, developmentally, functionally. What are their current needs? What are their current levels? How are they presenting now? How are they doing now? And we want to document all of that in this section of the IEP. So on the screen, you will see a sample. This is just a sample. This is not a real student. You'll see a sample of the first few pages of an IEP. And you can see at the top, what we call the cover section or the cover page of the IEP, will always have the identifying information of your student. So it'll have your student's name, their date of birth, their local ID number, the date of the meeting, as well as the date that the meeting should be reviewed again, that the IEP should be reviewed again, which is usually a year later. We'll also include the disability classification on the cover page as well. We're not going to talk about that today, but if you are interested in learning more about that, that will be reviewed at our next workshop. We'll be going over the disability classifications. So going into this page, you see highlighted over here the present level of performance and individual needs. Like I said, that's the PLOP, and this includes all the information that we just mentioned. The first section of the plop will be the evaluation results. That's the first highlighted section. So this will include any type of assessments that were done for your child, any testing, um, state tests, any specific assessments that were done for the evaluation, or any other levels, benchmarks, things that we feel that are necessary to understand where your child is at this moment will be included in this section. The next part will be the academic achievement, functional performance, and learning characteristics. That's on the lower part of this section. And what this talks about is the levels of knowledge and development in specific subjects and skill areas. So whereas the first part we were talking about test scores and assessments, right now we're really going into the actual performance. What do they know? How are they doing in each section? And it's important to note that the IEP really needs to be parent friendly when we're putting this together. So the team works hard to put information in there that's parent friendly so that you can understand what exactly they're talking about in terms of how your child is doing relative to the other students in their grade, in their classroom, and academically and functionally where they are at. So you may see a paragraph, for example, about reading, about writing, about language, etc. And there also may be a part if they're getting any therapies. Those therapists might put some little information about how they're doing in those areas as well. That would all be under this academic achievement section. So we're moving along and we're still in the plop, in the present levels of performance. Still talking about, and again, this is just an example. You can see a few things here. Ryan has made nice gains with reading fluency. Improvements have been shown since he was evaluated and treated last year. So just telling us where he is at right now, his current levels. He's currently reading on the level N. And the next highlight over here is the student's strengths, preferences, and interests. So I wanted to point out that a lot of times when you're hearing the information that's on the IEP, when you're sitting at the IEP meeting, we'll hear a lot of what we conceive as negative information, what we perceive as negative information. So we will hear a lot of areas of improvement, areas that our child is not yet on level or is not yet doing well, or areas that he needs support with. While that's important because we are trying to develop a plan for support, so we want to highlight those areas where improvement is needed. But as you can see from this section, we also have to highlight the strengths, preferences, and interests of your child as well. So it's extremely important that we include that in the IEP, and the team will ask you for those for that information if they're not aware of it themselves. And we also want to include parental voice as well. So the team will ask you questions for information. So be ready to give over that information and mention things that even if these are things that you may see at home, bring that to the attention of the team because we want to include that in the IEP as well. And you would see that in this section of academic development and functional needs of the student, including consideration of student needs that are of concern to the parent. So this is really the area where we want to highlight your concerns as the parent. We understand where he's at, we understand his levels, we understand what he needs, we understand his strengths, and now we want to know, what does that mean to you? How is this of a concern to you? What are you concerned about when understanding these areas of either his strengths or his weaknesses? And we want to include that in the IEP. Moving along, we're still in the plop, we're still in the present levels of performance, and we're going to talk a little bit about social development. So we spoke about the academic levels, we spoke about the testing scores, the assessment levels, and now we want to talk about their social development. So in terms of peers and adults, the feelings about themselves, the social adjustment to school and community environments. So again, the team at the school will be including information over here about how your child is exhibiting these feelings in school. And again, we want to highlight strengths of your child. For example, over here, they wrote that he's kind and caring and always willing to help. That's a social strength. And once again, we want to hear from the parent of what you feel are concerns. What areas of social development are you concerned about that we need to include in this IEP section as well, so that the team is aware of that, whether it's something that you see at school or outside of school as well. And the final section of that area is the physical development. Similar to what we were saying before, again, we talk about the academics, we talk about the social, and then we want to talk about also the physical development. And it's the same format again, highlighting what we see currently, highlighting the strengths, and then highlighting the needs and the concerns, specifically those concerns of the parent and how they feel that their child is affected by that. So the final areas of the present level performance, again, we're still in the plot, but the final areas are these three sections. And the first one is management needs. And when we talk about management needs, we're asked to include the nature and degree to which any type of modifications are needed to be put in place to enable your student to benefit from instruction. So, I mean, it's kind of the word management. How are we going to manage the instruction? What other supports are we going to be putting in place for your student, for your child to get benefit from the instruction? So you will see different types of things. These are just examples in this section. But for example, for this student, they wrote that he needs positive reinforcement. He may need small group instruction or need to be redirected. He may need a graphic organizer to get organized and to really break down concepts for him. So you'll see a lot of different things in management needs, but overall, it's really looking back at what we said before in terms of the plot of what your child needs and the levels that they're at. And now we want to include in here, based on everything we said before, the areas that they need support with. How are we going to provide that support? What supports are we going to put in? Are those supports that the teacher is going to be putting in? Is there an extra adult support that's going to be put in? Is there a specific type of setting that we're going to put in? We want to put all that in management needs so we understand what kind of supports we're putting in to help throughout the instruction, throughout the school day. And the next part we have over here on top, you see, is the effect of student needs on involvement and progress in the general education curriculum. And the effect of student needs on participation in appropriate activities. So we've said everything that your student needs support with. We mentioned the different tools and supports, the resources that we're going to put in management needs, how we're going to support them. And now we want to know, how is that going to affect their participation throughout the school day and different activities. So for example, over here, they wrote that his speech impairment is impacting his ability to function on grade level in reading, writing, and math. We would like to see more detail in terms of that. How would that affect him? Is he not able to express himself? Does he need extra time to express himself? Right? We can put all of that in this effect as well. We really want to know what we've outlined prior to this, his needs, his supports, his deficits, his weaknesses. How is that going to affect your child throughout the day? So we really want to see a paragraph over here, understanding will they be able to participate in all regular classroom activities or throughout the school day, or will they need some more support for that, and why? That's really what this effects section is about. And the final section over here, and then I'll stop for a minute just to get any questions, is student needs relating to special factors. This is the area where we just few questions about maybe special situations. Does the child need any type of language supports? Does the child need any behavioral supports? Is there a behavior plan being put in place for this student? Is the child blind or visually impaired that he needs support with that? Or are there any communication needs where the student may need a special device or a special service to get access to the learning in the school day? So before we move on to the next section, that's really the plop, and it is a lot of information. The IEP is rich with information. So I just want to stop just for a second, see if there's any questions, if anybody wants to unmute or put in the chat. You can always ask the questions at the end as well. Okay. Okay, and are there any questions in any of the interpreter rooms?
I have a question actually. At what point do they identify that a student might need help with any specific area in school, meaning like if they're not reading properly or like not socializing and stuff like that, how does that happen? At what point throughout the school year does that happen?
Thanks. That's a good question, and that really there is no real timeline for that. That can happen at any time that a parent has concerns or that the school has concerns. We are really kind of past that point in this presentation because we're talking about the point where we've already identified that and how we are documenting that. We do have a presentation on the IEP process. Louis, maybe we can link that in the chat. Um, the IEP process, which really goes through how we would go through the evaluation and the process for getting the services. Today, we're really talking about when we're past that point where we've already decided that and we already have that information.
I
But thank you
see.
for the question.
Okay.
I have a question in the chat. It says, does all the school have the capability to provide accommodations for the child needs? I mean, depending on the accommodations, and we'll talk a little bit of that further in the presentation, it's going to really depend on what the accommodations are and how they will be implemented. So it's really specific as to what the accommodations will be, and then the school team, together with the parent, will decide how that will be implemented. And then can evaluations be requested by a parent to occur sooner than once a year? For instance, 6 months instead of 12 months. Nicolo, absolutely. Every request will be considered, and then there will be a written response of whether or not the team feels that that is something appropriate or not, and then they would go from there.
Hi, like so I'm sorry, in regards to the accommodation, because I asked about that. So like for example, if it's accommodations for like an extra teacher or extra aide in or class, would that be possible?
So I mean, we will talk about professional support, for example. That's an adult to work with students. We'll get in that in a few slides. That would be something that can be recommended either on an IEP, or if it's a student without an IEP and they have a 504 plan, that's something that could be addressed in that way as well, in that capacity.
Okay, and then one last thing is if that student, and is it like across general, does it apply to like their gifted and talented program as well?
A different what? Say that again?
Like, does it apply to like if my child is in the gifted and talented program, does that apply to her as well?
Yeah, I mean, even children in gifted and talented programs can have an IEP, but if we're talking about special education services, like we said on the first slide, special education services are for students with IEPs. There are certain accommodations that can be provided through a 504 plan, but that's not really the focus of today's presentation. But you can definitely reach out with any specific questions about that as well to me personally.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so moving along, the next section of the IEP is going to be the transition section. It's what we call the measurable post-secondary goals. And we'll go quickly through this because this doesn't apply to all students at all times. This is really for students age 14 or older, sometimes younger if it's deemed appropriate, where we want to put post-secondary goals and really develop goals for transition for the student upon them leaving school and going out into the world. So what you'll see over here, and again, it would not be applicable to younger students, but from the first IEP that will be in effect when the student is in New York City, will be 14, we would have measurable post-secondary goals over here. So you would see goals maybe in the area of education and training, or employment, or independent living skills, things that the team would develop based on assessments, based on working with the student to develop a plan and supports that the student would need as an adult to enter into the workforce or to enter into further learning once they graduate and they move on. And then there would be also a statement over here of transition needs, where we're going to document in a statement of how we will address those needs of that particular student for their transitioning when they move on, in terms of whatever courses they may need or supports or training that they would need for that. The next section that we'll discuss, next section of the IEP, is the annual goal section. And just, oops, second, just going back for 1 second here, just for the transition. There is a corresponding portion of this on the IEP later on in the IEP, which Melissa will discuss. So we'll go a little bit more into depth in that as well for the transition. So the next section is the annual goal section. And basically what this section requires is for us to look back at the plop that we spoke about before, right? We documented over there the needs of the student, the areas of deficit, the areas of strength, and based on that, the team is able to develop goals based on whatever was documented in the plop in terms of what we're going to address throughout this IEP year. These are just some examples based on the case that we're looking at in terms of, you know, the goals that they came up with. Again, we're just using this just to go over the different parts of the goal section. But basically, you see over here the measurable annual goals, and the goals are recommended to enable the student to be involved in and progress in the general education curriculum, right? So we really want to develop goals, again, based on the information that we already have in the plop about what we're going to put in place to support in specific areas. So for example, here you have a math goal, you might have a reading goal, and you have a goal for speech and language. Depending on the individual student, you'll see different areas that are highlighted in the goals, but they should be you know, specific to the needs and also specific to what we said prior to the plop, whatever's on the plop, and specific to whatever they are trying to achieve on their level as well in terms of the grade level curriculum and expectations for the classroom. So that's what you'll see over here. And just to see the sections over here, for each specific goal, you will have the actual annual goal. So you'll have, for example, here it says within 1 year, he will improve his expressive and receptive language skills by identifying supporting details and main ideas, etc. And then you'll have the criteria section. And the criteria really identifies how well and over what period of time we want the student to perform this goal, right? So for example, in this case, they put in 4 out of 5 trials over 3 consecutive sessions. There's no specific template that you will see. Everything would be, you know, specific to the student and specific to the goal of how they want to measure that. But the criteria is really the measurement. How are they going to see? What are they going to look at to see that he is achieving this goal? The method is how they will be measuring that progress. So the criteria is what we want to see him achieve, and then how we're going to be checking that. So for example, here they're going to use checklists, they're going to be collecting data, and they're going to be observing him through these activities to see whether or not he's progressing towards this goal. And they're going to be measuring this. The schedule is telling us when they're going to be measuring it, right? Obviously, we don't want them, you know, checking this every single day. In this case, they're doing it 1 time per month. It should be definitely something that's reasonable because over here, if we're talking about 4 out of 5 trials over 3 sessions, so 1 time per month does sound as something that's reasonable, that can be done. And in that case, they're going to be measuring it and documenting that. And again, we're using all this information and we're collecting the data because we want to make sure that we're not just putting a goal here, but we're actually putting a goal that we expect the student to achieve, and we're actually documenting and monitoring how they're achieving that throughout the time of the IEP. Now, in terms of that, as I said, we're collecting the information, we're monitoring the progress, we're collecting the data, and then we're actually also reporting that progress to you as the parents. So the next section you'll see after the annual goal section is the reporting progress to parents, which identifies when the reports on the progress towards the goals will be provided to the parents. So in this case, they wrote that it's going to be provided 5 times per year. That's not set. This can depend on the team, on the school, on the student. At a minimum, schools are expected to provide parents with this progress at the same time that general education students receive progress. So for example, you know, whenever report cards are given out, you should be getting a report of progress on the IEP as well, And then we do expect that you should be getting a little bit more than that as well, because this is something that's more individualized and ongoing. So we want to have that a little bit more frequently. But whatever it would be documented in this section. And then just over here, this is what you would see in terms of the actual progress report when they give it to you. So you would see actually on top, you would see the goal that is being reported. And then you would see if this is the first progress report for the IEP or the second progress report. And then you would see over here the report. How are they doing? Was the goal achieved? Are they working towards the goal? Was no progress made? And then it would say, you know, what the expectation is. Do we anticipate that you will achieve the goal, the student, or do we need to modify the goal, or is more time needed to achieve that goal? That's what you would see on this progress report. This is the actual report that you would be getting. Okay, any questions on the, we spoke a lot about transition and about the annual goals. Any questions about that before we move on?
I guess the only question in the chat right now is somebody's asking, where do we go to view the videos of how to apply for IEP and the process of it? So if we
thanks,
could
Melissa.
yeah.
Yeah, Lewis will put that in the
Yeah.
chat for them. Okay, thanks. Okay, so we'll move on to recommended special education programs and services. This is the next part of the IEP, the next section, and this is really kind of you know, it's a big section because this is where we're going to actually document the actual program that we're putting in place. Now, again, there's a reason that this comes after what the other steps that we took. So the first step, like we outlined, was the plot, where we're identifying the needs of the student. The next step is the actual goals that we're putting in place to address those needs that we mentioned. And now we're going to the recommended special education program. Now that we have goals, now that we know what we want the student to achieve, what program and services are we going to put in place for the student to achieve those goals? That's what this section is about, and that's why it comes at this point in the IEP process. Oops. So just a note before we go into the actual page and what it would look like, we do have a continuum of services. And so you'll see here the different types of settings that might be recommended for a student in terms of services, you know, all the way from general education where they're not getting any services to really very restrictive and settings where, you know, they may not be able to attend a community school, and everything in the middle, from a special class, from related services, from getting special education teacher support services, which is one-on-one or in a small group. And the reason that I put this blue arrow over here going up and down is just to show that this is not like a step ladder where a child will be placed in one and then has to work their way up to get to another level. Rather, this is individualized and it's flowing. So depending on the needs of the student can be in any one of these areas at any given point in their education, and they can move in and out of them depending on how they're doing. If they're making more progress, if they're making less progress. And we can also have them in different settings at the same time, where, you know, for certain subjects, they may be in one type of a setting, and for other subjects, they might be in another type of setting, depending on again, their individualized needs. So this is a sample page of what it might look like for the recommended special education programs and services. And again, over here, we're going to be listing the services, the program, based on everything that we put together and the goals that we've developed and how do we want to develop those goals. So in this case, what they recommended for this student was SETS for ELA, and that's the special education teacher. And in this case, you'll see how they're delivering that service. It's going to be directly to the student in a group, okay, in English. The frequency will tell us how many times. So they want to do that 5 times per week. How long is the duration? In this case, it's going to be for the period. So really 5 periods a week. Where the location, where we'll be providing this will be in the general education classroom. So the teacher will be working with the student inside of the classroom, not pulling him out of the classroom, but working with him inside of the classroom to work on the ELA skills. And then we'll always see a projected date of services to start. And that's over here, you know, for example, May 2022. Sometimes you'll also see an end date of services as well. If it's something that we don't want to continue for the whole year, you'll see an end date here as well. And just to highlight, if you go down over here, you'll see the other sets that they recommended, for example, for social studies. And over here, they put in that it's going to be in the sets room. So the location is different here. And the location here would be where they're pulling the student out of the room and working with them in terms of that. They also recommended for the student integrated co-teaching for a period, for a subject, for math. So you'll see here again, how many times per week? That's going to be 5 times, 5 periods a week. And that also is going to be in the general education classroom, meaning that that will be inside of the integrated co-teaching classroom, where the special education teacher will be working alongside the general education teacher to work on those math goals for this student. So again, this is just examples. You can see all different types of things over here. You might see special class, you might see sets like we have over here, you might see ICT, but these are the different settings that you would see over here, and you may see combinations like we have in this example as well. On the same page, it's usually on the same page, just lower. I just have it on 2 slides, but it's usually on the same page. You will have the related services section as well. And in this section, it's going to list what types of related services the student is going to get in addition to the actual class setting. So in this case, they recommended for the student counseling services. And again, you'll see the type. I think it's going to be in a group. The frequency is going to be 2 times per month for duration of 30 minutes. And it's going to be, the location will be a separate location in another office for this student. So they recommended counseling and speech therapy for the student. You may see, for example, occupational therapy, physical therapy. Those are different types of related services you might see in that section as well. I just want to also highlight while we're in this section that you may also see adapted physical education in this section of the IEP for your student, for your child. And that is really, all students are required to have physical education. Adapted physical education provides the student with specially designed physical education instruction. So there may be some modifications, some adaptations that your child will need for them to attend physical education classes. So that would be listed in this section of the IEP as well. And also not noted over here, but you may also see a recommendation of parent counseling and training in this section as well. And that is a support that we provide to assist parents in understanding the special needs of their child. It is required on IEPs for any student that is classified with autism. And so you may see that on this section of the IEP. And again, that is a support provided and facilitated by the school for the parent. The next section over here, you have supplementary aids and or services and program modifications. These may be, different things that we're putting in to support the student in the setting that he's in. So for example, if there needs to be some type of physical accommodation for a student, we would put it over here in terms of allowing them to be in the classroom based on their individual needs. We might also have assistive technology for them if they need a device or a service, maybe a computer, maybe a communication device, that would be listed over here as well. And you may see supports for school personnel on behalf of the student. So for example, if this is a student that needs some type of specific service and the staff needs to be trained on that, you would see that over here, any type of training or support that we would provide for the school so that they can support your child as well. 2 more things that are not listed here, but might be on this section. A student may require nursing services, and that would be listed in this section as well. If they needed any type of nursing treatments during the day, during the school day, that would be listed here. And then you might also see listed over here, paraprofessional services for your student as well. And when we talk about that, we do generally have a few types of paraprofessionals that can work either one-on-one or in a group with the student. and that would be a crisis management paraprofessional where they were working to address specific behaviors of the student. We might have a health paraprofessional that's there to monitor a specific health concern of the student, or we might have an orientation and mobility paraprofessional that's supporting a visually impaired student, or we might have a toileting paraprofessional who's assisting a student that has toileting needs throughout the school day as well. All of that would be documented in this section as well.
Nathan, we have about 20 minutes remaining, okay?
Thanks, Louis. Okay. So we're going to save the questions to the end and we're just going to move along. If you have any questions, even put them in the chat and then we can get back to that at the end as well because I don't want to hold anybody over the time. The next section will be the extended school year services section. And for this section, you're going to see on the IEP whether or not we're recommending 12-month services for the student. Generally, schools run from September to June, right? It's a 10-month program. But there are certain students that based on their level of regression, that we are concerned that they will have significant regression over the summer that will cause them to need at least 8 weeks of reteaching, of relearning. And for that reason, we want to provide them with support over the summer. And we would note that in this section of the IEP. It's important to note all students regress over the summer. That's normal for any child that's developing. But when we talk about significant regression, that would require more than 8 weeks of reteaching, that's when we want to provide a special service. And the service may be the same type of service that they were getting during the year, or maybe something else. They may only need support in one area over the summer, and so we would list that over here if it's a different service that we're recommending for them. The next section on the IEP that you would see is the compensatory services section. So this is a requirement of New York City now based on federal and state regulations, where at each IEP meeting, the team will discuss with you whether or not your student is still demonstrating lacks of progress and gaps in learning based on the fact that in March of 2020, all schools went remote for learning. So this may or may not be applicable to your child. But this has to be considered at the IEP meeting, and they will discuss whether or not there are still gaps in learning and progress. And if yes, they would mark down yes. If no, they would mark down no. And if the answer is yes, they may recommend a certain type of service for your child to help to bridge that gap and make up for that loss during that time. But regardless of whether or not they're recommending it, this does need to be discussed at the meeting with you parents. The next section of the IEP will be the testing accommodations. So testing accommodations need to be completed and documented over here. It's very individualized in terms of what every student might need. And there needs to be a serious process of documenting and assessing why the student would need that type of an accommodation, because obviously we want to be careful in terms of, what we're imposing on a child for a testing period. And then it's also important to note that the accommodations would not only be for state tests, but these accommodations need to be implemented during local testing as well. So it's important to know how that's going to affect the child, throughout the school year when they're being tested. These are just some examples. For example, they may be extended time where they're getting more time for a test. There may need a separate location or a room due to distractions, or they may need prompting or even test read, for certain tests. This may be a type of accommodation for your child. And again, that would be documented in this section. It's going to say what the accommodation is. It's going to say the conditions. So when do we want that accommodation to be in place and how that would look, and then how we're going to implement that. So for example, for the separate location, you see here that they would do it in a group of no more than 12. So you should be very specific. You'll see specifically what they're going to be doing and how they're going to be implementing that and what that means for your child. So now we move on to the coordinated set of transition activities. And this connects with what we said before about those students that would be transitioning. And I'm going to pass this over to Melissa.
Hi. Just wanted to make sure you can hear me.
Yes.
So we're going to get into coordinated set of transitions. So give me 1 second. So this section really starts for students at the age of 14. Now, sometimes It can end up going on the IEP a little earlier. It just depends on the students. As we know, this is an individualized plan. So sometimes what works for some students doesn't work for others. So during this time, this is usually updated, whether it be through an annual or through a reevaluation. The team has to consider a student's strengths, preferences, and interests while identifying activities, services, and supports that facilitate the student's movement from school to post-school activities at this time. And the slide that's up right now, that gives you all the sections. So if we're speaking to the instruction, it'll tell us what kind of service we're providing for the student and who in the school would be responsible for helping that student obtain that transition activity. Now, every student that receives related services has to list a set of coordinated sets of activities as well on this section. Give me a second. And for most students during the community experience, the IEP must indicate if a student needs to participate in a community-based experience or learn to access community resources as well. And the other section is called the development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives. So this is why a main reason is most of our students that, have this section are 14 and over, because we're looking at the transition from students from middle school and preparing them for high school and moving forward. So this part usually identifies what services or activity the student needs to prepare him for employment and to assist the student in meeting other post-school adult living objectives. And our last part is, when appropriate, we like to, consider the activities of daily living and the functional vocational evaluation. So if appropriate for your student, the needs of a student must include activities that directly impact dressing, hygiene, self-care, self-medication. And then it must also include a need for functional vocational assessment as a transition service or activity. So our next session that we're going to get into is the participation. Now, the participation speaks to all students with disability must be included in state or district-wide assessment programs. And alternate assessment is also a part of this section because it's where we consider if a student would require alternate assessments. Alternate assessment is not something that every student with an IEP obtains and is found eligible for, because alternate assessment necessarily is for students with a severe cognitive ability that really are unable to participate in the general education assessment, even with testing accommodations. If the IEP team determines that the student will participate in alternate assessment on a particular state or district-wide assessment, the IEP must document this. So looking at this slide right here, this site just stated that the student, it states whether the student was participating in the state assessment or was participating only in the alternate assessment. And the bottom parts usually discuss particular students with certain needs. So in this section, it states for the students that are school age, it stated Ryan will participate in a regular class, extracurricular, and other non-academic activities. And then it also states if the student is not participating in a regular physical education program, identify the extent to which the student will participate in specifically assigned instruction in physical education, including adaptive physical education. Nathan previously got into what adaptive physical education. So we do have some students that don't participate in regular physical education. So this is a section where we would state that due to the student's physical impairment, it requires adaptive physical education. And once again, that doesn't apply to all students, because we do have some students, whether they have an IEP or not, that they participate in regular physical education. And the lower portion of this slide speaks about exemption from language other than English for a diploma requirement. And this is also something that the IEP takes into consideration And what we look at for that is really language development over the years to determine if the student's disability adversely affects him or her, the ability to learn a language. And this would be the section where we state yes or no. Okay, now our next session is special transportation. Some of our students might require special transportation and some might not. So if a student doesn't necessarily need special transportation on the IEP, we would usually list none. Now, if a student does require special transportation, then we would pick that and then try and see what the student needs. The needs could range from having an adult supervision on the bus. It could range from a student needing space for a wheelchair, or if a student is a bigger child with a wheelchair, to make sure the bus accommodates for 2 spaces for the child. Some students, due to their medical needs, might require air conditioning on the bus, or a shorter route depending on their needs. And this section would help us, bring in all that information. Usually to review this, our Office of School Health would help us. We would have to send out a form from the student's physician indicating the needs, and then it would be reviewed. And that's how we would identify what needs to be on this section for the student. Now, placement recommendation. So under this, there's a few sections that could go in there, and it's all depending on what's recommended for your students. So a majority of our students will either go to a non-specialized school district. And if we have other students for higher needs, they would go to a program that, and the IEP would state it's a New York City DOE specialized school district. But most of our students, especially initiating, will start at the non-specialized school district. So the summary page, which is one of our last pages, what happens in this section is it's basically reviewing all the information that we spoke about from the present level of performance, where it discussed like the student's name, when the meeting was held, whether this meeting was an amendment, and then there's the instructional functional levels. Now, data and information pulled from that usually comes from data provided during assessments, whether they were school assessments or assessments during an evaluation or a reevaluation, where we're determining where the student is in the areas of reading or math. So depending on the student, like this one, the student is falling within the functional level of the 2nd grade for math. Also in this section, thank you, we list a program that was recommended. So in this particular student, his programs that were recommended were SET, integrated co-teaching services, and SETs again, possibly for the other subjects. And the related services, which were spoken about, are in this one, counseling service, as well as speech and language therapy. And the next section will talk about the 12-month support, whether it was recommended or not for the student, and if the student is participating in state assessments or not. So in this section for this student, the student would be participating in state assessments and not be considered for alternate assessment. And then it's summarizing the other sections, such as, does my student have a behavior intervention plan? Some of our students require that support. So it would be listed in this section right now. It's listed as no, as a student didn't need it. And the recommended, if they were recommended for specialized transportation. So at this time, this student was not recommended for specialized transportation, and the school type that was recommended was a non-specialized DOE school. Now, medical alerts is where we like to be most detailed, because this is going to tell us what the student needs medically if they need anything. So this information is usually like very important. It includes also physical limitations. So if the student needs a barrier-free school, also codes into the accessibility. If the student needs a school building that's accessible, this student did not, but some students might. And if the student has limited mobility, would be in this section as well. So along with this section, we got into promotional criteria. So what's summed up is this, is in the current year, we're re-recommending that the student, did the student need promotional criteria for a specific subject? And this would either be ELA or it would be math as well. So for this student, it says modified. Not sure what particular area, but it was picked as modified for the student. And that information also comes from working with the school, and during the IEP meeting, the student data would be reviewed to determine if he or she required modified promotional criteria. Now, our lower section speaks about the options that were considered. So in this, this student specifically had SETs and integrated co-teaching. So what they were considering was, would the student be able to have access to the general curriculum if they were only recommended general education, which was not an option for the student, whether the student was only found that he or she were considered for related services only, integrated co-teaching, or a special class in a community school, and then the reason for rejection. And this could be different at every meeting, whether it be that we thought the student would, function better in an environment with more students because they definitely had more skills, or because of the student's need that they required a smaller setting to support their needs. Now this section, this is our final section. This is called the attendance page. So in this page is all the members that attended the IEP meeting. So depending on your student, if the student is in a community setting, then you will, and this is an initial evaluation, then a student will always more than likely have a special education teacher present and a general education teacher present. The parent participates in all initials, and definitely we make all attempts to have the parent participate on all reevaluations. A district representative is somebody that participates in the meeting. It's somebody that's representing the Department of Education. Usually during an IEP meeting, if there is some sort of disagreement, or we're having difficulty coming up with a recommendation, the district representative steps in to really hear both sides and make a recommendation during that time. If your student does receive any type of related services, providers usually are able to go to the meeting. So in this instance, it was a guidance counselor as well as a speech provider. So the name would be listed to the middle and the signature to the right. And usually we upload this onto our system to make sure we know who participated on that meeting. So a part of this IEP, what usually happens is when we finalize the IEP, IEPs are able to be translated. Now, it does take a little bit of time, sometimes depending on the language. It could take us up to, a few weeks to be able to get you an interpreted IEP in the language that you are requesting. Nathan, I'm not really sure. We have quite a few languages, which range from Spanish, Mandarin, and all our other languages. So it's been a really, really great choice for our parents to be able to have those documents in their language. So you would get one in English, and then if you're requesting one to be interpreted or translated, we could be able to get you one as well, as long as the school knows and you make them aware.
Absolutely. Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, and just to add, throughout the process, at any point of the process, you can have, like we have today, an interpreter. So at the meeting as well, you can request to have an interpreter and then actually have those documents, like Melissa said, translated as well. So it's 12 o'clock, so I think we did well on time. And thank you, Melissa, for the final part. This was a lot of information. I hope it was helpful for everybody who's here and for those who will be watching afterwards. I'll stay on for a couple of minutes with Melissa if there's any other lingering questions. I don't see anything in the chat, but if anybody has any other questions, you can just unmute or put it in the chat, and as well in the interpreter rooms if there's any questions. Thank you.
Hi. So, my name is Carmen. I sent out an email to you in regards to starting an IEP for my daughter because she's being evaluating for ADHD and she's behavior-wise she's not doing too well in class. So I'm just wondering, like, her neurologist sent out like a referral to get like her being evaluated by the district. How
Mhm.
would I get that started?
How old is your child?
She's 5.
She's in kindergarten already.
Yes,
Okay,
but
yeah, I
she's in a
see.
GNT class.
Yeah, that's fine. I see the email that you sent me. I can help you. I will loop the school into the email. I'll include them so that they're aware of it. And then they can help you get that process started.
Okay, like so since she's in the GNT class, does she have to get out of the program then?
No. First of all, they're going to evaluate her and go through that process and make any recommendations. Um, you would actually obviously have to consent to everything along the way, and then you can hear what the recommendation might be, and then make a decision of whether or not she needs any changes in terms of her program. But being in GNT does not mean that you cannot have an IEP.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Sure.
No questions on the Spanish line.
Thank you.
So far, no question in the Mandarin line.
Thank you.
No questions on Korean line.
Okay, thank you, and thank you all for your services with the interpretation. Really appreciate that. And thank you all that participated. Again, you have our contact information, myself and Melissa, so please feel free to reach out with any other questions that you might have. And thank you and have a good day.
Bye.